It's actually quite convenient with Zoom stream.
Yeah, seems like
I didn't know there was an integration.
It's a nice integration, yeah.
But there, I can, from very stressful experiences, I can tell you that the scheduling thing doesn't work at all. That doesn't work at all. Like I think I've tried to schedule 2 meetups and just ended up having to get a new stream because it just didn't work. It didn't connect. So that's a bit stressful. Okay, so we have a link. It's excellent. And we can go ahead and share this. So I'll move back to. Now we're back on the tab, right?
Yep.
Excellent. Yep. Let me just distribute this out. So I'm guessing I'm sharing, rather than sharing the tab itself, I'm sharing the entire window. There we go, the tab. So let me post this. There we go. Okay.
Did we share the link?
Yes, I will. See if I can find my way back to the chat somehow. I'll go ahead and post it on Slack too. There you go. And just one final spot where I need to put it. You got it, Joe, right?
Yep, got it.
Excellent. Excellent. Oh, caps. Yes. So I think without further ado, we can go ahead and get started. Just going to bring up this over here as well so I can see. Yes. Okay. So yeah. So this is the 3rd edition of the Relay Meetup. And I guess we can call this a pretty special edition, having multiple members of the core team here. We'll go ahead and do a round of introductions, but we're, as always, streamed live and recorded on YouTube, which means that you can go ahead and watch this from the beginning if you're in late for it. And also, like usual, if you have ideas or you want to present something for this meetup, go ahead and just reach out on Twitter. Like anything, all from just showing how you use Relay, or it could even be Q&A sessions with people who just started using Relay. That's always very interesting as well. But yeah, I'm going to cut off a lot of the usual things I have here, just because I want to spend as much time as I can talking to you guys who are here. So we'll go ahead and do a round of introductions, and I can start. My name is Gabriel, and I work at a consultancy in Stockholm called Arison. And I'm hosting this meetup, and this is the 3rd edition. So it's been a fun experience so far. And we can move over to Robert, perhaps.
Hi, I'm Robert. I'm on the Relay core team. I used to have, I guess that my usual fun fact is that I used to have hair down to my shoulders and play in a band. But then that that's I guess a 15-year outdated anecdote. So now I'm at Facebook. So
Nice. And you?
Yeah, I'm Joe Savona. I've been working at Facebook for about 6.5 years, most of that time working on Relay. So yeah, just happy to be here. Thanks for hosting.
Thank you. Lauren?
Hey, I'm Lauren. I am a new member on the Relay core team as well. I've been mostly working on React server components, and I'm also really excited to be here.
Thank you very much. Let's see here. So yeah, so like usually I have a pretty thick agenda here where I talk about lots of things, but yeah, we'll scratch all of that and we'll devote as much time as we can to talking to the core team. And we have a bunch of things that we are going to try and cover, like themes, I guess. And we've gotten questions from the community on quite a lot of these, and I'll try and chime in as things go along. And also, if you're interested in asking questions yourself, you can just go ahead and post them in the chat, and I'll try and cover them as well as possible. But yeah, so let's start with the first topic. Relay hooks going stable in 2021. So I think maybe we could lead off with the hooks effort overall, like what it has been and what the journey has been. I know it involves the new Facebook.com a lot. So maybe just a brief overview of what this is and how it's going to affect like Relay going forward.
Yeah, Robert, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So Relay Modern was built around container APIs, which sort of have not ideal usability. And one of the things that we did was rewrite Relay in terms of hooks. And these have so far been released under an experimental tag, but they're used throughout Facebook. They're stable, so experimental is a bit of a misnomer. And one of our goals has been to release hooks stably. Obviously, it makes it more difficult for us to encourage other people to use Relay if the best practice is to use something that's labeled experimental. So this half, probably by, hopefully by the end of February, maybe by mid-March, we will release a major release of Relay that includes all of the hooks APIs front and center. And that's going to involve, well, there's a few things we need to, fix up about them. And it also involves sort of a rewrite of our docs. So a lot of our internal docs will be exposed. So I guess we heard your complaints loud and clear that the Relay docs could use improvement, and hopefully we'll begin addressing that. So yeah, that's sort of the plan.
Wonderful news. That way, I have a bunch of questions about docs. So that's very nice. That's very nice.
Yeah, the one thing I would just add to what Robert said is that so we kind of did two things simultaneously with the development of Relay hooks, and that's one was the hooks APIs, but the other was kind of suspense and moving toward full concurrent mode compatibility. So we're sort of somewhat concurrent compatible, but in particular, really hooks support suspense for data fetching, and kind of is built like so the idea is that there are certain patterns that will work even better when upcoming versions of React come out, and you can have like the new concurrent mode, but that also still work in the kind of current suspense mode that's available on stable React today.
Right. So the so I guess it won't be concurrent mode only, right? So it's nice, because that's also I think something that has been a confusion around the current experimental APIs that they've been. I don't think they've even been labeled as only concurrent mode, but that's the way people have interpreted them at least. That's
right. Yeah,
that's very
but
nice.
I think that's like a key is that by kind of moving to Relay hooks, you're not just getting like the ergonomic benefits of hooks compared to containers, but also kind of setting yourself up for your app to be compatible with the future of React.
Right. So this makes you kind of detaches you from React releasing concurrent mode and suspense as well, like or the new experimental things there. That's really nice. But so your usage at Facebook of the hooks APIs, is that all in concurrent mode, or are you also not using concurrent mode with the hooks?
Facebook is the core app is, or I mean, the core website uses concurrent mode. I'm not sure if all of our properties use concurrent mode, or all of our apps use concurrent mode, but at least it's well tested with concurrent mode.
Yeah, I think there are definitely places where people are using hooks and not in concurrent mode. Yeah, definitely exists.
But your main use case has been concurrent mode when developing this. Yeah, right. Cool. One question that we got, I think that might actually be better for the next topic. It's around, we've gotten a few questions about server-side rendering, but I think that's much better to cover in the talking about server components. So I'm guessing you feel like this has been a quite a long journey with the hooks APIs. I remember when were they first released as experimental? That was over a year ago, I think, right? Yeah,
that sounds right. About a year ago, because it was like around the time that you joined the team, Robert. I feel like maybe a little bit before, in that ballpark. But I mean, we've kind of been developing them for a year and a half, 2 years now. Because I mean, hooks were announced 2 years ago, I guess. So, right? Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah, ReactConf 2018. Yeah, so.
And I think also one interesting aspect is that it has, like, I watched the repo, some of the commits, and it has felt like this has been stable for quite a while for you, at least. Quite not too large refactors and changes and whatnot. Yeah,
so I think the kind of core APIs have definitely been stable. Like, so for, I think use fragment, use pagination fragment, and use refetchable fragment. Those three APIs have been pretty stable for quite some time. It's kind of like the other APIs around that, like load query, use lazy load query, those things that are like, we've been like a bit more evolving on like what the recommended patterns are for actually loading a query, just because of not wanting to have side effects on render, but also that being a very convenient pattern, and kind of trying to find like a middle ground there.
That's interesting, because we also got a question about entry points. Is that something that's going to be covered in the initial release as well? In the sense that it's going to be, because there are no docs for it right now, and I know that there's docs in an issue somewhere. But yeah, it's a very interesting API that I feel like a lot of you're making heavy use of at Facebook, and that not a lot of people in the community has heard about.
Yes, the entry point APIs will be part of this release, and will be included in the docs.
Nice. So speaking of the docs, like sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that entry points sort of require some integration with a router. And I'm not 100% certain what the current status of using an external router with entry points is, but conceptually, it's not an extremely difficult integration to make. In practice, maybe there's some difficulty.
I know there's a community member, Edwin, who's using entry points, I believe, and has integrated into Webpack, and has a proof of concept for that working.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so I think it's at least it's on its way there. So entry points, for those who haven't heard about that before, it's a way of loading code and data at the same time. Well integrated with Relay. How much would you say entry points has sprung out of, I guess, like, of course it has sprung out of the needs of Facebook, but like how much is it a Facebook-y kind of solution, if you get what I mean, compared to like what you'd come up with if you had a smaller, less complex app? Because it has quite a lot of surfaces, is my impression after having looked at it.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So I think right. So I think there's a lot of things you can get away with in a smaller app that just don't work like once you kind of pass a certain size. Um, so uh, so if your app just has like enough code that you don't want to download all that code for like every single route that you go to, you're going to start want to do like code splitting per route. And once you do code splitting per route, what happens is you're on, you go to like your home route, and then you click a link to go to a different page. Well, now you got to download that code. And while you're waiting to download the code, you're not downloading the data. And so entry points lets you speed up those types of transitions. So I think, a small app can get away with, like, if a very, very small app can get away with not code splitting but per route, but really, like, you almost always should be code splitting by route just to make every page as fast as you possibly can, and then entry points make sense. But again, you can always obviously start without it, and like, this is like a feature that you can add on if it's helpful to you.
Right. So, and what will happen with the old container-based APIs? Are they, well, they're just going to be deprecated, I guess, or?
We're still figuring out the exact details, but most likely there will be at least a single release with at least a single major release that contains both the container APIs and the hooks. Then eventually, maybe we'll move them to a separate package. But they're not going to go away. We're not sort of forcing people to upgrade against their will. There's always going to be a possibility of continuing to use them if you so choose.
Because I can imagine you have quite a lot of usage of them still, like in your code bases.
Yeah. I don't know if we have counts right now, but yeah, definitely a lot of both.
Yeah. Cool. Anything you'd like to add around the hooks APIs going stable? So we know it'll involve docs and it'll involve the code itself, of course. And
yeah, if you look at the master branch right now of Relay, you're going to start seeing docs be landed. And if you're interested, and for that matter want to provide feedback, we're open to, or we would love for members of the open source community to take a look at the docs that are landing. It's under website-v2/docs. And yeah, and you can build the, it's a DocuSource website, so you can build it locally and see how the website is going to end up. Yeah, so feel free to take a sneak peek.
Is there anything in particular you'd like the community to look at, or is it just in general?
There's going to be a guided tour section, which is sort of the core of our internal documentation, that we think is probably is going to substantially increase the quality of the documentation, and is a much better way to learn Relay than anything that we've put out already. And yeah, there are probably blind spots because internally, developers don't need to worry about setting up new apps or installing things or running the compiler. Like, that's all set up for you. So I think the guided tour plus like any sort of oversights that we haven't covered, just because the docs are very much adopted from Facebook internal docs.
Yeah, one thing that like one goal of this kind of effort is, so right now we're in a situation where we have the relay.dev external website, and then we have an internal wiki page that has versions of docs. And so our goal with this is actually to have a single source of truth for the docs, so that we aren't in this situation that, like, we want to be able to just have Facebook engineers tell them, here's the link on relay.dev, go, if we get a question, and that will kind of mean that the open source docs are kept more up to date, and hopefully we get better coverage. But obviously, as Robert mentioned, like, there's going to be, I'm sure there's going to be some gaps. Like, we're working to address them, but I'm sure we'll miss some things, and would love feedback on that.
That single source of truth sounds great for us in the community. That's going to be such a lift. That's awesome.
Yes.
That's what a gift.
Yeah.
That's I'm you're well aware, but usually
right.
documentation is where the shoe
Right. Yeah.
Shoe
No,
doesn't fit
we've
for people.
yeah, we've heard the complaints, and it's
Yeah.
like, you know, it's actually something where I think this is a situation where maybe from the community's perspective, it seems like it's only an issue for the community and not an issue for Facebook, but it actually it's an issue
Yeah.
internally too, because we have to keep these two docs in sync. And like sometimes like there's a better doc, you know, in the open source version, sometimes like the internal one is better. And it was like, okay, like which topic is this? Like, where's the better doc for this? And so that is actually not great for us. And it'd be nice to just have like one place to direct people to. And yeah, so it's just better all around. So we're glad that we can finally do this.
Yeah, awesome. So I guess we'll leave the hooks API on that note, because that's a very good note. And we'll go ahead and move over to talking about React server components and Relay. And I think most people who follow React stuff will probably have heard about this, but we should maybe do a quick recap of what this is and kind of how you've worked with the React team to develop the first, I guess, prototypes of this is suitable. Yeah, suitable mentioning it. So whoever wants to take it away.
Sure, I can give a quick overview. So if you didn't catch the announcement that we made last in December, we announced this new feature for React called React Server Components. And server components are a new type of component that you can write in your React application. And this tells React that you only ever want this component to render on a server and not on the client. And this is really interesting because it has a number of benefits for you as a developer and also like for your users. So like the most obvious one is because the components are now rendering on the server, that means that you don't need the code on the client anymore. And what that effectively means is that server components do not get shipped to your client bundle. So if you have lots of places in your application where you are fetching data and mapping over it, or just writing components that are like highly static, that don't have a lot of interactivity, those are really great candidates to be either server or shared components. Shared components are components that can render both on the server or on the client. But I think interestingly, it's also, especially if you don't use Relay, server components can be a very interesting way to do data fetching. And while we do have a Relay integration for server components, you don't have to use Relay. Obviously, I'm biased and I'll tell you, like, if you're considering using a data fetching solution, you should probably consider Relay. But if you aren't, there's no restriction. So you'll be able to use server components regardless.
So speaking of that, what does the relation between Relay and server components become?
Yeah, so it's interesting. In a way, they complement each other. So there's quite a bit of work that we had to do like behind the scenes to get Relay and server components working in our infrastructure. But for the most part, it actually looks very, how to say it? I think it looks very, at least to me, very idiomatic. I don't know whether Joe would agree, but the way we've implemented it is, so within Facebook, if you can query for a server component the same way that you would query for any other field. And what's really nice about this is the call for that field is actually type safe. So Joe wrote this like awesome script that basically extracts signatures from server components and then generates a schema extension. And that essentially tells you like, oh, for this particular server component, these are the props that we can pass to that server component. And so the Relay and your GraphQL can enforce that whenever you are trying to render that server component, you're passing in the correct props, and the general niceties of using GraphQL are still there. So I think for the most part, it works really well together. And I think once we're further along, it should feel just like using GraphQL. Like it should be more or less transparent to you. Obviously, there's some work on the server that you need to do to be able to actually render those server components and return them in the response format that we want. But once you can do those things, then actually using Relay and server components together should just feel like writing a regular React application and GraphQL.
That's nice. Is that extension thing something that's going to be or considered being open sourced, or is that very tied to Facebook? Or
I don't think it's very tight. Like Joe, you probably remember better since you wrote it. But from what I remember, there's nothing really specific to Facebook in there. I think we just need to do the work of open sourcing it. There's another thing that I didn't mention, which is like we have this conversion script that essentially crawls through your dependency graph, and based on which components can be server rendered, we will automatically convert that to server component for you. That is something I hope to open source later in the year. But that will, especially if you have like a large existing application, that should make the migration process for using server components a lot smoother, because otherwise you have to like convert so many components. The script just takes care of a lot of that for you.
There's also the lint rules too.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah, the lint rules.
Yeah.
Lint rules?
So lint rules around like basically enforcing that so for example, there's like some rules around which types of components can use which features. So for example, a client component can use state, but a shared or server component can't use state. And so we have lint rules that they enforce based on the file extension, that you're not violating those rules. And that, for example, server components can't directly import a client component. You have to kind of use a special API, no, I think that well, internally we have that limitation, but we're kind of working on that. I think the idea is that externally you just do a regular import and it kind of magically works. But there's like certain limitations around like where you can have these imports. For example, a client component can't directly import a server component. So like lint rule enforces that for you. I think there's a bunch of the pieces. So like some of those pieces can be open sourced, and then there are some Facebook specific things about like how we actually execute server components. That's like very coupled to Facebook's infrastructure. But I think what we can come up with there is sort of the compiler. There's a contract between the compiler and the runtime around, this is the field that the compiler is like, okay, I'm going to convert what looks like a call to a server component as a field into this generic call, a field that sort of has to exist in your schema. That takes like the name of the component to render and the props, and has to kind of return back a certain shape that the runtime expects. So as long as your server kind of implements that contract, then you'll be able to use this. And I think we can document that contract, and then hopefully people can add support in the community.
Yeah, that's nice. So it's not about it's not that tied to Facebook infrastructure. That's right. So like, how far along is this project, you'd say? Overall, like outside of Relay server components?
So I don't know if I can comment on like when React will actually launch the stable version of server components, but at least internally, we have like one product team, one part of their product using server components, and our goal for this half in the year is essentially to get server components to a state where a few more teams can adopt, maybe with some assistance, but for the most part, pretty self-directed. That's the kind of high-level goal that we've set for ourselves this year. Yeah.
Cool. It's a very interesting project. It's interesting how it's hard to. I haven't had time to play around with it properly yet, but it's hard to imagine. It feels like it could really remove a big chunk of what you know of like writing apps or issues you have around data fetching and managing the state around that, which is very interesting.
Yeah, and one thing I didn't mention that I think is particularly interesting about the Relay integration of server components, that I don't really know if you can do this as well if you didn't use Relay, is because Relay and GraphQL essentially, I guess Relay in particular encourages you to co-locate the like things like fragments with the components that use them. So this pattern actually, I think, works really well with server components, because this allows you a lot of opportunities when you're executing those server components on your server to know ahead of time what data is needed. So you can only pick the thing, the data that you need for your server. But the really other interesting thing is also at the same time that we're rendering the server components on the server, we can actually fetch the client data in advance for you because we know ahead of time what the client components also need. So what that looks like in practice is much fewer round trips where you don't have to, jump back and forth between your server and client to get additional data. You can just do it all at once, which I think is really a core value proposition for using something like Relay.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
and that's enabled by the colocation.
Yeah, and then the other aspect is, so we've talked about how server components allow you to basically access server-side, server only data sources, which is a very powerful feature. But the kind of nice thing about, but if you do that, you're kind of stuck with a server, a server component only, right? Like if you're reading from the file system or you're talking directly to your database or something, you don't like that. That component is now really going to be stuck as a server component and not shareable. The nice thing about GraphQL is it can work on the server, it can work on the client, and so if most of your components are just using fragments, then they can be shared components, and so this lets us do things like, have a page that shows, some like product, like a product detail page, right? Or imagine like a person's profile, or anything that you might want to have like a view version of the page and then an editable version of the page. And so for the like view only version, we can server render that and just have only like client leaves that are interactive. But if we want to do editing, now we can client render that and have an interactive preview as you edit using the exact same UI components, right? So we don't have to have two different versions. We have one source of truth, but we render it optimally depending on the circumstance. And so using Relay in combination, or really just GraphQL in combination with server components, lets you do more shared components. So I think that's kind of I think so far we've actually focused a lot on server components, but if anything, it's like shared components that are actually like the real superpower.
Yeah, because that's very interesting because it's easy to think of it as you're just splitting things up here, like here are server and here are clients. But like reusing it sounds really powerful. So how's the reception been for the product team that is now trying it out? Like, have you got the feeling that it was easy to pick up, like the philosophy around it and how to use it and everything around it, or has it been, how has it been as compared to what you expected?
So for the first integration with that product, I think we did a lot. We did a lot of the initial conversion work because we had to get lots of different pieces working, internal pieces working, and it would have been just much quicker for us to do it. I think this half is when we plan to have that product team do more of their own conversions. So I think it's a bit too early to say how the reception is there. But I can say at least that there's internally a lot of interest in server components because of the fact that that means better performance and better performance without a huge cost in terms of ergonomics. Like for the most part, it just looks like you're writing regular React application. So one thing that I think is like people are constantly pretty interested in is also, so I think if you watch the server components demo that we did last year, Dan mentioned that we got to somewhere around like 20% or so in terms of product code savings. And actually really interestingly, we haven't done any more conversions. We have, we kind of stopped at the end of last year, but the number is actually now up to close to 40%. And I think that's really interesting because, products are obviously gonna constantly be evolving. You gotta add new features, but using server components mean that you don't always necessarily have to pay that cost on the client. If you can, like Joe was highlighting, if you can prefer writing most of your components as shared components or server components, because then you get that flexibility of either rendering it on the server or on the client, depending on the nature of the problem you're trying to tackle.
Yeah. So a question of curiosity, but have you been server rendering a lot at Facebook before, or is this something that has? So you already had like an infrastructure around that, I guess. Otherwise, because what I imagine, like one thing with server components that could be a bit tricky is that if you have a statically rendered app, or rather you have a client-side rendered app fully, like you have to kind of align your infrastructure in a new way, which could be interesting. But so that's not something that has been a new thing for you now. You've server rendered a lot before, I take it.
Yeah. So Facebook, the new Facebook.com like uses server rendering to kind of improve the initial time to see the time to kind of see like the visually complete version of the site. And then I think we're using React selective hydration in order to kind of improve the time to interactivity by kind of prioritizing hydrating the part of the page you're interacting with. But kind of all of that can help. But you still end up ultimately downloading all the code for all the parts of the, the entire app. And server components lets us go one step further.
Because that's we got a few questions around server-side rendering and whether that is something that you are focusing on for Relay. Like obviously you are with the server components and whatnot, but like also outside of server components. And I guess maybe entry points is something that is vaguely related to that, at least. Like it simplifies server-side rendering for us who don't have the Facebook router.
Yeah. So right. So entry points are actually part of our current how we're doing server-side rendering internally. So basically, you hit a route, we figure out what entry point that corresponds to. We call the entry point function to figure out what queries with what variables to load. Also, we then know what code you need for that route, so we can start telling the client, go download this code. Right. And then also go we load up those queries and then send it down. And then also, so we're kind of taking the information from the entry point, sending the code, the data to the client to do the client rendering, and also kind of sending that to into the server-side rendering pipeline. But I think the key is, even if you don't have like a kind of support for like suspensey server-side rendering, and I'm not totally like perfectly aware of what the current state is in the open source world, I apologize. But one thing is that because all the queries up front, you can choose to just simply wait for all the queries to be ready and then start your server-side render. And that way you kind of don't have this like need to kind of repeatedly like try re-rendering and wait or something like that. Yeah.
That's one of the things that excite me the most about the entry points. And also same with server components. It's, I guess, more about the philosophy of Relay of aggregating things and co-locating and whatnot, that you actually can figure out like what data is needed for a large chunk of your page. But that's also something that it sounds very interesting, especially combined with what code is used and whatnot.
Right. Yeah. So one kind of interesting note is that entry points is actually like a subset of server components. Yeah. So, an entry point is basically a server component that immediately returns a client component and fetches some data, right? So it's actually like a proto server component, and is one of the, as we were kind of evaluating server components, we're like, oh, this is like one of the things that is replaced, that server components kind of subsumes or replaces. Yeah.
Nice. Just a big server components haymaker going around replacing stuff. So, I guess one final question about server components. How has the experience working on this been? I can imagine this is quite a fun area to work in.
I can definitely personally, my experience has been, it's been super fun. I think so. I have like a full stack background, so I think server components in particular were super interesting to me because, obviously there's a front end piece, but it also talks to lots of different systems. So you kind of have to think about lots of different, parts of the system. So I think working on it internally has been really fun. And there's also lots of interesting patterns that have yet to be explored fully, because we've obviously been using server components a little bit, but I think the more we use it and the more the community gets to use it, the more new patterns will start emerging about like how best to leverage server components that we haven't even seen yet. So I'm just really excited about, getting to the point where we can get server components into people's hands and, seeing what people figure out, because, there's lots of really awesome developers out there who are, doing really interesting things. I'd love to see what they come up with.
Yeah, it's I know there's been a discussion around using Relay for static sites, but without trying to pay without paying the cost of downloading all of Relay. I guess server components could be a step in that direction for sure, like being able to use that without, yeah.
Just can I just add a little bit to what Lauren said, if you don't mind? Yeah, it's definitely been really fun. It's actually been, as you might imagine, kind of like a long road to get here. But I think we've had kind of ideas floating around, different angles on, how do we allow people to move logic to the server, and we kind of evaluated a bunch of different ideas internally, very declarative DSLs on like this one spectrum to kind of UI agnostic, like can we just move arbitrary computation to the server and have that computation be shared, kind of like a sort of like a GraphQL, some sort of more GraphQL focused, like data focused approaches. And then also kind of looking at, okay, well, obviously one thing, if you could do arbitrary computation and have it be shared across client and server, like one of the things you'd obviously consider is what about just rendering UIs as like a, that's becomes like, and then so just over kind of iterated on those different kind of design ideas. And so it's been a really fun collaboration kind of across the GraphQL, Relay, React teams to kind of finally realize this final vision. So it's been an interesting path and I think a good opportunity for all of our teams to collaborate.
Yeah, because I guess you've collaborated very closely with the React team on concurrent mode as well, because Relay was a pretty integral part to developing that, I guess.
Yeah, I think we were kind of like the sort of first early user of concurrent mode and figuring out how to make suspense, data fetching suspense work, how to make a somewhat concurrent compatible store, and we're continuing to iterate on how do we get really like truly concurrent compatible data stores in a way that doesn't just work for Relay, but that allows other different data solutions to integrate with React as well.
Right. Well, great. Any other parting words for this segment? Or I personally very much look forward to continue to hear about this, because this feels like, it's one of those things where you feel like it's hard to grasp how much this could change, like in how you work with apps and think about apps and whatnot. So it's very exciting to follow this along. So let's move.
Let me add
over.
one quick thing to the server component bit, which is if you haven't had a chance to check out the demo, maybe take some time to watch it, and then at least play with the open source repo that we shared, and maybe as a fun exercise, you can figure out how to use Relay with it. But that should give you if you're interested in getting some hands-on introduction to server components, I think playing around with the code would be a fun way to do it.
I will make sure to tweet the link to that. And also, but like, so it is possible to get Relay running there in that open source repo, I guess.
It should be. If you come up against any issues, let me know, or Joe, and we can help you.
Awesome. Let's see who races there first. So let's move over to another, I guess, quite long-going project as well, the new compiler. And I guess a bit of backstory is that the current compiler is in JavaScript. And I guess this is also maybe a year or 1.5 years back that you started working on. I can't remember when those started turning up, but yeah, a rewrite of the compiler in Rust. And I guess we could maybe start with what the main motivation of rewriting it was. Like, what wall did you hit, I guess?
Yeah, Robert, do you want to go?
So the limit we ran into is that we had sort of sort of eked out all the performance we could have out of the JavaScript compiler, and incrementally making it a couple percent faster here and there just wasn't going to work, given how the usage of Relay was increasing, how quickly it was increasing at Facebook. So we sort of needed a big rewrite, or a good solution that scales with the level of the challenge. So we evaluated different languages, and in the end we settled on Rust. I like to think it's because Rust is just an amazing language to use, but there were a number of reasons why we ended up picking that. And the end result is that the performance of the Rust compiler blows the JavaScript compiler out of the water. Even now, even despite that, we're finding places where we can improve the performance of the Rust compiler. So it's only going to get better at this point. And more importantly, it's also built sort of as a platform, I guess you could say, on top of which other teams are able to build different tools. So there's a separate, there's a separate parser, and there's separate sections for code gen, and different teams that need different parts of the Relay compiler can sort of pick and choose what they need. And so one example of that is that the LSP is built on top of the compiler. And I don't want to jump the gun on that, but like that's an example of where we reuse some of the infrastructure that the Rust compiler that we built for the Rust compiler, and it was it was good. So, and like lastly, as you might imagine, writing a compiler in JavaScript is maybe not the most maintainable choice, and so it's certainly been a bit of an easier job to work with the Rust compiler than maybe it had been previously. I don't know if I missed anything, but there's probably more context that you can provide.
Yeah, I can just add a bit more. So so when we approached the Rust compiler, we had a very explicit kind of idea around building this as a compiler platform. So with the original Relay compiler, I think we kind of designed, so for example, we had an internal IR that was aware of like Relay specific constructs, and we actually kind of kept some of them. Like I think we kept like condition nodes, right, which like aren't like an official, don't have an exact correspondence to an AST typing in the GraphQL.js implementation, for example, although it is like include and skip our part of the spec. So it kind of felt like a reasonable choice. But in general, we kind of went back to keeping the internal representation of queries and documents closer to like a generic representation, and having relay specific features added kind of as like these like internal directives that are kind of meta, like kind of compiler specific directives. And so it's layered in a way that you can like basically just use the parser. You can have a schema representation. You can do printing. You can write your own. There's a kind of generic set of utilities for writing compiler passes that manipulate the documents in some way. And then there's the Relay specific pieces that like put all that together to achieve what Relay compiler needs. And so in addition to the IDE, our server team has actually used these pieces to like do a few tasks, and like they're actually like taking in schemas, merging them and manipulating them, and kind of spitting out new schemas, things like that. And then we have, as folks may be aware, there's a non-open source. We have a non-open source native GraphQL client that we use in our iOS and Android apps, and that also requires code gen. And so those teams are actually looking at using parts of the Relay compiler. So I think this is kind of sort of a Rust alternative to the GraphQL.js stack that exists in open source that really could power an arbitrary code gen toolchain.
Right. So a couple of questions about that. So one thing is this platform philosophy, is that intended to also be shared with the open source version, so to speak, or is that more of a like internal Facebook thing at this point? Like, or is the because I know there's been quite a lot of discussions before about my interpretation has been that you have tried to avoid a bit to become like a compiler toolchain only, like that you can plug in your own things into.
Yeah, that's a good
so I guess
question.
that's one.
Yeah, so I think so. We've been reluctant to kind of encourage people. So, for example, Babel encourages people to, or like has traditionally supported kind of arbitrary configuration of plugins, and you have to be a bit careful about the ordering of those things. And so we've been a bit hesitant there. So we do have a part of the compiler that configures like a set of transformations that run. And so in a way, it's like, yeah, you could configure that, but the compiler's written that way more for kind of modularity and like maintainability purposes. But like you actually do have, there is, kind of dependencies between those that the team has to be aware of. That kind of feels a bit unavoidable in a compiler. So I think in terms of like Relay compiler, I think our view on that is not really changing here. Although we do want to make it like something that people can configure if they really want to, but most users like really shouldn't. But for the kind of the rest of the tool chain that we're building on, I think we're not like ready yet. We're still doing a lot of iteration. I think we're not ready yet to like, have those be published and have those be, stable crates that people could build things upon. Yeah. But that's definitely something we're thinking about as like, doing as we get toward like open sourcing the compiler. I imagine what happened is we open source the Relay compiler first. And then once we're a bit more confident in the APIs, maybe then publish crates for them. But that's still something we're kind of just still talking about. Yeah,
right. Nice. But so I guess what I was getting at is it's not a non-goal to have that in open source.
Yeah, we're just not sure yet because but I think it's something we'd like to do. But obviously, if once we do that, we only want to do that if we're really sure that we can commit to like having that be a platform that people can build upon. So I think we want to just be very, very deliberate about that. We don't want to put that out there and then kind of have it be not abandoned, but I think because we would still use that as our foundation of our compiler, so we're not going to abandon it. But I think we'd only want to make it a like suggested for other people to build upon if we are really able to support that. So I think that's why we need to deliberate a bit. Yeah,
nice. Yeah, I see. And then like you mentioned as well, I guess one point to take away is that it is the foundation for the compiler. So like, and you've built it that way. So like, no matter how you do it, if you open source it, there's going to be building blocks that you can use, I guess, if you want to. But yeah, whether it's an officially supported way of doing things or not is another thing. I know it's quite interesting because there are a few, like for instance, something that we've talked about in the Relay chat is the Relay Swift client, and I know that the author that is probably going to have to compose together like the compiler in some way in order for things to work. But that's very interesting to hear. And it's also interesting that because I don't want to jump the gun with the LSP either, but it's a very interesting way of doing it that enables a lot of patterns that are that also going to, like as with the docs, are also going to solve a lot of issues for the Relay community the way the LSP works. But not jumping the gun.
We can jump the gun. LSP is fun to talk about.
Yeah. So let's maybe just try and wrap this one up a bit. So like an open source release of I guess this isn't in any way even like tied to open sourcing hooks, or rather hooks going stable. This is its own thing entirely. Is there a plan for when you'd like to kind of release this as stable, or because there are a few like I know me and a few others in the community have managed to got it working locally, but there are a few like rough edges that most people won't like to do it that way. So there are a few missing bugs, but is there some form of timeline or idea around timeline or?
Robert, do you want to talk about that? Let's go ahead.
Yeah. We have this planned, and I don't think we've set a concrete date to release it, but it's within our sort of we're probably going to start working on that this half, and whether it gets released this half or not, maybe we haven't committed to that yet, but hopefully soon.
Nice. And just to sum this one up, like how is you touched on it before, but how has the experience been of, because I believe you ported it quite like one-to-one as one can do between JavaScript and Rust at first. How was the experience of taking it? Because I mean, it's quite a large project that's also quite advanced. Like, how was the experience of doing that?
Yeah, I think it went pretty well. Robert, obviously, you were familiar with Rust before. Yeah, and then Jan and I had some Rust experience as well. But there were a few people on our team who had zero Rust experience at all. And I think we kind of, Jan and I did some of the kind of scaffolding. For example, Jan was building out the schema representation and the schema parsing. I added support for parsing like the syntax and the IR representation and transforming, writing a transform. And then once we had that foundation established, it was really, I think, pretty easy for folks to come in and say, okay, here's a JavaScript, compiler transformation that like just takes the document and adds an ID field where it should be, or does some other manipulation, and just support that logic. And I think one thing that helped there is that we were using Flow, so that the code was like, already, not so dynamic that Flow can't type it, for example. And then also we were kind of doing mostly kind of treating the IR as immutable, and then making copies, which lent itself pretty well with Rust, where it's like, okay, you just do a copy and then mutate it, and so we can mostly just translate those patterns one-to-one into Rust. Obviously in Rust, like, it's safe to mutate, but you only if you have a local your own copy of something. And so we could clone and then mutate, for example, safely, and then that worked out pretty well. So I think that the kind of the coding patterns that we had just lent themselves pretty naturally to porting to Rust. There were a few things we had to figure out, but like we tried a few things like using arena allocation, which would have meant like complicated lifetimes. And so we just ended up using ARC, atomic reference counter object, for those unfamiliar. But yeah, there were some small things, but overall actually went pretty well.
Nice. Well, impressive work. That's quite a bundle to convert.
And I think it was helpful that we were trying to convert sort of an existing code base from one equivalent compiler to another. And we could essentially like track internally on a dashboard, like how many lines of code created by the new Rust compiler differ from the lines of code that are emitted by the JavaScript compiler, and vice versa. Like, did the Rust compiler ever error when the JavaScript compiler didn't, or did the JavaScript compiler error when the Rust compiler accepted it? And basically we just tracked these metrics until there were no observable differences between the two compilers. So obviously not foolproof, but like with a code base our size, like hopefully that covers most of the cases.
Yeah, and I guess is the Rust compiler now the main compiler you use at Facebook?
Yes.
Is the JS compiler deprecated, like not used altogether?
Almost.
Or almost?
Almost. We still use the JS compiler for a few tests internally to like sort of dynamically generate a schema and to dynamically compile some GraphQL. And we have some tasks to convert those to use the new compiler. And I think I think that's the last blocker for us deprecating the JavaScript compiler internally. I think.
Right. Nice. But so like all of the artifacts used in production with Relay is now generated by the Rust compiler.
Yes.
Cool. So final question about this then. Is there anything the community can do to help open sourcing this, or other than just simply testing it as soon as it's available? Is there anything else that you can think of that would be helpful?
One thing, maybe, I mean, possibly helping us convert, as Robert mentioned, like all of our runtime unit tests are using the JS compiler to dynamically compile queries, and that's something we have all these tasks for internally. So that's something that the community could help with, but I think we just need to be organized because we don't want to have somebody internally start converting the same thing. So we have to get that organized a bit before we ask for that help. But that is definitely a thing that people could, in theory, help with. and that would be
Yeah,
appreciated.
if you're interested in looking into that, the relevant issue number is 3199 on
Oh,
the
thank
Relay
you.
repo. Yep.
Thanks, Lauren.
Yeah, I remember. I think John maybe talked about this before as well. Okay, thank you very much for that. Let's skip on to the next juicy part, the Relay IDE and editor support. Yeah, we could maybe start with what, like, I guess there are multiple parts to this, but start with maybe what the IDE support is and what editors you plan on supporting. And yeah, and we'll get into the capabilities of it and the ambition level, I guess, as well. But so the idea is the LSP is basically providing autocomplete and whatnot, right, for Relay specific things.
Yeah. So LSP is a protocol that different editors implement, and in particular, VS Code implements it. So we've built a VS Code extension that uses an LSP server, which is Relay run with, which is the Relay compiler, acting as an LSP server sort of under the hood. But the actual layer that connects to VS Code is pretty thin. So it should be doable to reuse this in Sublime if Sublime supports the LSP. I think it does, and various other editors. So in terms of like the ambition and what kind of features it supports, like it builds artifacts for you. So essentially we're trying to not require people to run the Relay CLI anymore. Although whether we turn that on by default or not is still sort of an open question, because there's a little bit of, we don't want to surprise users when they edit a file and suddenly see a bunch of generated files. So we're still working on sort of how to message that to users and how to make sure that there's no surprises. We support going to the definition of fragment spreads. And also there's a few sort of Facebook specific ways to go to definitions of fields. We're going to probably support, going to the schema definition for a field, and also sort of having some sort of way for other consumers of the LSP to sort of like provide their own functionality, such as in this case, going to a field definition. Obviously, the field definition is not part of the schema, is not part of is not part of the Relay world. It's written in another language. So it doesn't really make sense for the LSP to know about that natively, but we want to provide you with the ability to add that functionality to your project if you so desire. We also support going to references. So if you're on a fragment, you can find all of the spreads for that fragment. We support autocomplete for scalar and link fields, arguments, variables, fragment spreads, directives, and we want to continue to extend that list. And when you hover on certain fields or different parts of a GraphQL tag literal, we show helpful information on fields, types, arguments, variables, directives, and so on. And we also have some code actions at this point in time. So Relay requires you, although maybe not in open source, at least internally, it requires you to name fields, name queries and mutations and fragments and subscriptions in a particular format. So if it's misnamed, we have a code action that suggests a better name or a conforming name for you. And yeah, then there's a few other integrations that are sort of Facebook internal only, such as showing extra information about queries that won't ship with the open source version. So what's nice about this is that this LSP essentially runs the compiler for you under the hood, and then we just added a few integrations into the compiler to sort of extract out the schema, the compiled schema, and what we call a program, which is just information on all of the different documents. And we just use that to provide all of these features that I just listed. And long term, the integration right now with the compiler is, like I just described, it's pretty simple. The compiler runs, it gives us new data, and we use that data. And long term, we want to sort of start making the integration a little bit deeper, such as by restructuring the compiler to be a little bit more on demand and to, improve the performance. Right now, we, at the size of sort of our code base, we have like run into some performance issues. And so we want to, decrease the memory footprint, make a few things faster, generally adopt a lot of patterns that should make the LSP a lot more stable and performant. And then, sort of eventually roll it out to open source. So yeah, that's sort of that's the overview. So.
Yeah, great overview. I think one of the, at least for me, one of the main takeaways is the fact that it's capable of running the compiler for you, so to speak, or producing that, because that also like removes a big hurdle that people feel when starting out with Relay, that you have to have a separate compile step running. But now you really don't. Like, you have to have a config file, but you'll spend your time in an editor anyway, and you have to run it, of course, in your build step and whatnot. But for your day-to-day editing, things can be a lot smoother, I guess. So I like the list you counted there was pretty comprehensive, I'd say. So what I interpret is that you're looking to support as much of the Relay isms as you can, I guess, around, like, for instance, the arguments that you mentioned and those things, like things that only the Relay compiler could know, like where fragments are located and what arguments they have and those kind of things. So what state is this in currently internally? Is this something that Facebook engineers are using day to day, or?
Yeah, there are several hundred engineers who have opted into using it. And we're slowly going to roll it out to more and more users and make it sort of something that people no longer opt into at some point in time, that they maybe can opt out of, and eventually it's going to be, eventually it's just going to be shipped by default to all Facebook engineers. The nice part about that being that I think that if you're a new engineer at Facebook and you're, it sort of eliminates a bunch of complexity that you otherwise would have to worry about when developing front-end code. Just being able to like jump to definition and not have to understand that like you can look at a fragment name and therefore deduce that it's probably from this file, or being able to jump to sort of where a field is defined, which might take you, to code in a different language. Like all of these sorts of things, I think will lower the barrier and make it easier for new engineers to become quickly productive with Relay and with UI development at Facebook. And so that's why we're sort of really excited about rolling this out by default. Maybe existing users will think that like, hey, something's, this doesn't match my my mental model of what should happen, but new engineers, they don't know any better. So
yeah, I think the process of being in like developing and so I think if you're writing a Relay app today, whether it's internally or an open source, you're like, okay, I've got my fragment, I've got a user, what fields can I fetch on a user? Okay, let me go to graphical, or maybe I go to the definition in my schema and like start looking in order to figure out what fields are there. Then you go back to your editor and you can query them. But being able to have the autocomplete and just search for just the same benefits that graphical provided of inline autocompletion and filtering, like you get that. And then another thing is that's kind of a pain is you're looking at an existing fragment and you're looking at some field, like, okay, what exactly like is the definition? How exactly does this field work? Like what is its behavior? And then you end up like doing, okay, let me do a grep for this field name and attempt to figure out where that came from. But of course, like there's all these generated GraphQL files that also come up in the search results. And so you have to like narrow it down, like, oh, there's the PHP file that actually defines this thing, and figure out, and like maybe like it's interface, and so it's defined 5 times, and like you finally figure out, oh, there's like the one definition. And so we've the IDE allows us to like just jump directly to the right one, which is pretty nice. And again, like that's somewhat using internal features, but I think we can find a way to make that work in open source. Probably people have to plug in something, as Robert mentioned.
Yeah.
But I think the kind of more general, I feel like the features we've built out are very comprehensive and incredibly powerful, but I think there's room for even more as we go forward. So, right now, maybe I'm a new engineer, and it's helpful to be able to see, yeah, I have a user, what fields are available on user, but what if there's some other information that I'm trying to get to that's like the person's like address, like where do they live, right? But like, okay, that's not actually a field on user. Like the name of the city where I live is a property of my address, right? But if we can start like allowing people just like type out what you're looking for, and we'll kind of fill in how to get there. I think like we can kind of go further to provide those types of features to just like help you figure out how to get the data you need and render it. And I think the other thing that we can kind of do is start saying, right now the IDE powers stuff inside of a GraphQL tagged literal. But what happens if we extend that to kind of provide more insights into the code that's consuming that data, kind of branching out a little bit, like don't want to re-implement flow, but kind of helping to augment the code, as you're typing. Slash, I think Gabriel, like you were kind of asking about, like, can we, you get as you're, you mentioned this on Slack a while back, of like, if you're typing in the IDE, you get to see the documentation from the schema on the fields, right? But then once you actually go to use those in your code, you don't get any documentation about like what does this field mean. And one way to do that would be to generate information into the generated code, so that, like, for example, Flow or TypeScript can pick it up. But another thing is that Relay IDE could just follow that for you, right? And I think that we could maybe give some more insights there about like how to use APIs like use fragment, use pagination fragment, right? We could actually providing insights about using those APIs. And so that's like a whole new area that we can start exploring once we get the kind of baseline features shipped.
Yeah, I find that that's a very interesting area, and having the LSP also as like you're talking about, like a source of relay information, kind of like a way to look things up, that would also allow people to experiment with their own kind of editor extensions and whatnot. I know I've experimented with Relay with adding like the unselected fields. This only works in a small schema, but the unselected fields to the actual autocomplete list, like where you haven't selected this field on a fragment. So you'd get first you get the fields that you've actually selected on the fragment, and then you get a small list with also like, oh, you haven't selected first name, last name, address, blah, blah, blah. You'd see them, and then autocompleting them would insert it to the fragment as well, and just rerun everything, and you have that kind of experience. It's like, so that kind of thing you could develop further in this scenario with having it as a way of looking up relay things, I guess.
Yep.
That's very nice. So how has the reception been for the engineers that have started using it? Because I can imagine it's quite revolutionary going from not having that to having that.
Yeah, I think, like Joe mentioned, the ability to go to a field definition is the biggest wow feature for teams internally. Sometimes if you're looking for a field and it has like a very interesting name, like address line 2 on da 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 da, or something, so just something very long, you might be able to sort of grep for it. But if the name of the field you're trying to find the definition of is name, like, good luck. So that's one of the things that's been, I think, has had the most positive reception.
That's cool. That's also that's a testament to the code base size as well. That's the thing that people really are excited about, being able to jump to the actual like definition of.
Turns out that computing the person's name is not as easy as you think. It's not just a database lookup of the name field.
Yeah, and personally, I'm also really excited because just like the Rust-based compiler, I see the LSP kind of as a platform in a way that we can extend in the future. So like one thing with, for example, like server components, like what would the LSP support for that look like? I think we're just really scratching the surface here. So personally, I'm really excited to in the future dive in and see how we can extend the LSP to, do more interesting things.
Yeah, Because I guess, yeah, the thing you were talking about before about selecting server components in GraphQL, or yeah, that would be a good contender for the LSP as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
Cool.
right now, the LSP is only configured to work on GraphQL literals and JavaScript files. But like, for example, it should be able to work with limited modification with GraphQL files. And like, also maybe move on to, supporting schemas, but there's other projects that don't have GraphQL literals in JavaScript files, but use GraphQL files directly. And it would be great if some of the code that we wrote could help them, give them similar IDE features.
Right, like you, Gabriel, you mentioned like relay.swift, right? Like that, and that project has you write GraphQL as a similarly kind of like tagged. I think it's like, if I remember the syntax correctly, it's pretty similar, but it's like a triple quoted string or something for the Swift equivalent syntax. But like, why couldn't the IDE work for that too? So I think that would be interesting if we could make it work.
Yeah. It's and I guess that also like makes, since it reuses the compiler, it solves two problems in one go. With the compiler has to also understand how to pick up GraphQL from other sources as well. Kind of like how the language plugins can work today in the JS compiler, that you can define your own way of picking that up.
Yep.
So if we have releasing hooks here and we have releasing the compiler here, I guess the LSP is a bit further along. Or is it related to the compiler as well, or how would you?
You're probably right that would be the ordering that they're going to be released.
Best bet to say,
yeah. Although I can imagine that like the IDE could maybe go first, but yeah, I think probably realistically what she said.
Because I guess the IDE needs to, since it operates on the artifact, you need to have. I guess Rust compiler. But
yeah, like in theory, we could turn off the artifact writing just so that you can get the IDE, like, the code intelligence type stuff. But is that like a patented term that I just said? I'm not sure. Hopefully those code and intelligence as like words that come in sequence is not a thing that is, or people are disallowed from saying, but it feels like a Microsoftism.
Yeah. You'll see in a couple of hours, I guess.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so we're running a bit short on time, but do you have time to just cover briefly the partial rendering stuff? Or yeah. Nice, let's jump over to that. So partial rendering is probably the thing here that's maybe, besides entry points, least known to the community. But it's about being able to render things from the store as you fetch new data, right? Existing things, but not just the full query, but parts of the query, the fragments themselves. Anyone want to do a quick overview from your perspective, what it is and how you're currently using it is probably pretty interesting since it's marked as experimental.
Sure, I can describe the feature. So there's two rendering strategies. One is full and one is partial. And full essentially causes an entire query to suspend at the root if any data is unavailable. And partial will cause individual fragments to suspend, or individual calls to use fragment to suspend. So for example, if you have some data that's missing on a particular fragment, that use fragment call will suspend. But if you happen to have wrapped that component that calls use fragment in a suspense boundary, you'll be able to still render the rest of the component and then show a spinner for that in that section. So this is useful internally. And if you don't have any suspense boundaries within your component hierarchy, then the render policy doesn't make a difference. Everything will suspend at the root because there's no suspense boundary to catch the use fragment from use fragment suspense, and sort of that bubbles up to the root component. And so this is useful internally because we have a few directives like @defer and a few others, where the data, if it's not available initially, will be sent in a follow-up payload. I'm seeing some quizzical looks from Joe here. Joe, do you want to jump in?
No, I'm just getting like a weird echo. Is anyone else hearing
Oh, okay,
this?
sorry.
Oh,
Oh.
No, I don't.
I thought, yeah, I was hoping I wasn't describing the wrong feature or something like that. And okay, okay,
No,
great.
I'm an idiot, and I opened up the YouTube link to see what the chat was, and of course forgot that it was going to play on my speakers. And so I'm like, this is why. Yeah, okay. Like, yeah, how do I look at this chat without hearing you? Again, I apologize for. Yeah.
I was
Yeah,
thinking like maybe
continue.
partial rendering refers
Carry
to
on.
something completely different, and like, you know.
What have you been working on?
Like, what team are you on? Like,
no, I just wow.
okay.
Yeah, so
okay. Okay, so okay, good. Well, that's good. So partial rendering essentially allows you to cause different parts of the tree to suspend independently, and this is useful because internally we support like @defer and other directives that will cause data that isn't available initially to come down in a follow-up payload. So you might request the user's name and also let's say a URL to their profile picture, and let's say that has to be generated by the server because it's at a new size that we've never requested before. So if that data is available, it all might come down in a single payload, and if it's not, there will be one payload which has the username, and then a follow-up payload which actually has the URL for the user's image. So that's partial rendering. The reason that is experimental and that we don't sort of turn on partial rendering by default is that the container API didn't have any concept of partial rendering. The container itself would have all of the data and would render it, or it would sort of show a loading indicator. And we don't want to have accidentally broken containers. Excuse me, when people convert from the container API to use hooks, we don't want them to have accidentally broken state where they assume that all of the data that was previously rendered by a container but now is rendered using hooks is either available or not available. We don't want to like to surprise them with a situation where the data might be partially available and still parts of the tree are rendering. So it's currently a feature that you have to opt into.
Right. But so because one thing that I guess you have this makes most sense with defer and stream, but it also makes some sense with already cached data, right? So you could fulfill some things from the cache if you have it for a new view. Like one thing that I've experimented with, because this is another thing that like once you start thinking about using this and having defer, you kind of change a lot like how you structure your UI and what you can do. Like it enables a lot, like you get a lot more control over over your view. But I guess my question is, you're focusing on defer and stream as the main thing that you're using partial rendering for. You're not using it as a way of kind of we have the avatar for the user here already in the cache, therefore we want to use the partial rendering just to be able to show that at the new page while we fetch new data. Like not just
that's you. Yeah, that's you, definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. But it's still like it's still in defer land, I guess. Because I guess you could do the same thing, but having the query resolve the full result, but letting it
so
render.
I think it's less about it's kind of less about defer and stream and more about where you have your it's actually more about suspense, I think, than anything. Like, so I think defer and stream come into this too, but really the way partial rendering works is like if any data is missing for a fragment, we're going to suspend. It's going to suspend. So you have to kind of structure your fragments and your UI such that, you know, for example, like you have imagine like a profile page for a person. You want to show their name and their picture, right? But if you don't have those, like you might as well just show a loading spinner for the whole page. But if you at least have like name and profile picture, you want to show that. while you kind of wait for all the rest of the data for the page. And so you can choose to use partial rendering, structure your fragment and suspense boundaries such that you have the kind of the component that asks for name and profile above a suspense boundary that asks for all the other data. And now when you go to that page, you can kind of, you're like not guaranteed, but more likely to be able to actually render because presumably you fetch those two fields like elsewhere in the app. And so you come here, they're already cached, you can render it.
Right. So, so partial rendering is actually the reason it's marked as experimental and not activated overall is the container API that the interaction between those. It's something that you use like a stable feature at Facebook.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Right. Yep.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. There's
That's
a few
nice.
APIs that just need to be like changed from saying unstable to like, yeah, it's stable. So we just need to update the name. Yeah.
So how has your experience been around? Is this something that you feel product engineers use a lot, or is it something that you sprinkle in certain cases, or is this more of a how much has this changed how you kind of structure your relay code?
So I think this is kind of interesting because it takes care to kind of use it like I described, right? You have to like really structure your UI carefully. If you add a new field, kind of above the suspense boundary, and then that field isn't present, that could cause you to start suspending.
Yeah.
And so I think it's something that we're like, we have the feature on for the new Facebook.com. I'm not sure kind of like how I might like, I guess I'll put it this way. I suspect we could be like getting more out of the feature. But I think that we need to kind of fill in a bit of the story of kind of making it possible to sort of enforce that people are not going to accidentally cause things to suspend, right? You want to kind of have a design and then sort of keep it like locked down that, like we want to be able to show, navigate to a certain page and always be able to show this section without suspending. And how do you enforce that, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's the piece that we're still iterating on. But the actual implementation of partial rendering itself is stable, and with like just attention to detail, you can achieve that nice sort of loading experience.
But it's nice that you mentioned that you're iterating on that. That's the one thing that I have experienced, and I know other who's tried the feature out. That you kind of need to understand that you need to help relay find its way to the fragment, kind of that you need to be able has to be able to find its way all the way to the fragment, rather than and adding a field somewhere in the middle is unintentionally going to break that and whatnot. Right. Yeah, I think that's, if there's a way to enforce that, that would be really, really cool. But I guess this is something that will organically come with releasing the hooks, I guess, because it's involved in that, that part.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There were a few questions in chat. I was realizing it would be kind of nice to cover if we have time.
Oh,
of course. I have
real quick before we move on from the partial rendering case, like just to emphasize, like the partial rendering policy of full is really only a fallback for the container case, and we would much rather the renderer policy of partial just be the default and be the behavior everywhere, and it is solely to handle the fallback case. We think that's a better experience, and sort of makes more sense logically overall. So.
Right. So I guess, would you recommend people who write new apps or newish apps only with hooks to enable it globally? Because I think you can do that on the environment, right? Yeah. Nice. Yep. That's very nice. So Joe, do you want to read something from the chat?
Yeah, so there's like a couple questions maybe we can get through quickly. Toby asked about the app module directive, and I saw that Jan from our team already replied, but I'll just add a little bit to that. So the app module directive is something that allows, the idea is that you can download some code and data only if if the data is actually present and matches a certain type. So the idea being like you have some content, like let's say like a media that could be photo or video, right? And you have like a photo viewer code, you have your video viewer code, and for any given piece of content, it's only going to be either a photo or a video. And so you don't want to download both pieces of code only to then show, like, not use one of them. And of course, you might have like multiple other different types. And so app module kind of allows you to say, have a field that returns a union of like, okay, like this media is either a, photo type or it's video type. An app module lets you say, okay, if it's a photo, download this fragment and this code. If it's the other type, download this other code, this other data. And kind of dynamically get just the code that you need. The challenge there is it has to integrate with a module system. So our kind of thinking on this is that is a very similar problem to what server components have, in terms of server components wanting to dynamically send down a module for client components, right? Whatever client component. It's actually like, so I mentioned that server components kind of subsume entry points. Well, server components also a little bit subsume app module and these like data-driven dependencies. So I think once server components kind of paves the way for Webpack and other bundler integrations for dynamically sending down code to the client, then it'll be a little bit easier for people to adopt app module, because I think there will still be use cases for that. And then the one other one that I wanted to touch on was support for defer and stream. So as somebody in the chat noted, our current implementation was based on the internal version of defer and stream. The open source spec, there were some small changes, basically like some renaming of fields drawing a blank. I think it was Rob and Liliana from the community had contributed, had really helped to push that spec forward. And then they've also submitted a PR that updates Relay. So we just need to like incorporate that PR, and then we'll have full open source spec compatible defer and stream implementations. The nice thing is that those changes are very superficial. It's like rename extensions.isFinal to like the top level has more field or something. It's a very, very trivial change. But otherwise, our defer and stream support is like fully, battle tested, production ready. We've been using it in production for over a year. So once we just change that, people can have a totally solid defer stream implementation on the client.
Nice. And there's a good thing to mention from the chat as well around TypeScript output, because that's been something that has been supported by the community before, and now it's actually integrated into the Rust compiler itself, right, in the core.
Yep, that's correct. Yep.
And
yeah, that was a really great contribution from the community. Yeah.
Yeah, that was. I guess we were all waiting for someone to pick that up, and then Martin, who did it, just like swept through it in a very impressive fashion.
Yes, that was a really great, really great change.
Yeah. But so I guess it's the intention from the core team then to support TypeScript as a kind of an output that's not in the hands of the community anymore, but rather that's nice.
Yeah, I think we'd probably appreciate like community support, but I think in general the part of the compiler where like the flow versus TypeScript comes in is like fair, like it doesn't change that much, because it really only comes in when we're changing the way we read out data to the UI, like to a component. So a large percentage of the changes to the compiler probably won't break TypeScript or something, but it's something we will have to kind of be careful about and may need the community to help out. Like we may have to do things like we do a flow version first and then hope to get like a community contribution for the TypeScript side. So I think we'll probably appreciate ongoing community engagement there, but it's something at the very least, we can't, like, because the code is there, we can't even land something if it's going to completely break TypeScript. So I think it puts it in a better spot.
And one interesting thing about the implementation itself, as compared to the one that is now in the JS compiler, is that it's at another level, so to speak, like you said. So it's you get much more for free. I don't think that TypeScript isn't going to have to play catch up like it's kind of like now. Which is going to be great for the community as well.
Yeah, the way that Martin implemented it, which is phenomenal, is basically like a two-stage, like a typical compiler, like have an intermediate representation. So there's like this abstract intermediate representation of like the types, and then there's sort of a flow printer that takes that abstract representation, turns it into flow code, and then a TypeScript one that turns it into TypeScript code. And so we'll sort of have to keep that converting the query into that intermediate representation up to date no matter what. And then it's just a question of keeping the TypeScript printer up to date, which hopefully is fairly straightforward.
Yeah, that's great. So it feels like it's in a better place now compared to the current JS one.
Yeah,
I got one question. Sorry.
Go ahead. I just had one more follow-up on the app module thing. So one person was kind of noting like about longer or queries and larger query documents. One thing that we're also looking at this half, kind of somewhat related to that, is right now the only so if you have a kind of a large commonly used fragment, or I should say a sort of fragment tree, right? So you have like some high level fragment that has lots and lots of subfragments under it, and then you have two queries that use that. Both query files are going to end up basically containing all of those fragment selections. And so we're working on a feature that would allow you to kind of have a shared normalization, a shared artifact. But so not every fragment would qualify. You'd kind of like manually, you kind of manually go in and say, okay, this fragment should be shared, but that would allow your two or multiple queries to share that. So there's a little bit of runtime overhead, but you're downloading, potentially much less code. And so that's an option that we're going to be enabling hopefully this half.
Is that artifact only or type generation as well?
That's really just for the artifacts that are used to process query results. So it's not about types.
So you don't care about the duplication of type, of course, because that's not going to end up in the runtime. Right. One question I got in the chat is around React Native and relay hooks. And I guess the first part of the question is what the usage of relay hooks in React Native looks like at Facebook, and your intention of how it's to be supported, of course, seeing as I believe still concurrent mode isn't available in React Native, right? But I think we partly clarified that by saying that the relay hooks release won't be requiring concurrent mode, but still, like, can you comment on how you use that internally, hooks in React Native?
Robert, do you know?
Gotta
find. I think you're.
Yeah, sorry. I think hooks are used in React Native. That is as much as I'm certain about.
Trying to find the product thing you're like.
Yeah, I believe. Yeah, so I know that they are used. I think not as extensively as in the new Facebook.com. But hooks do work in React Native. Again, as you noted, the concurrent mode is not enabled yet in React Native. I think that's kind of coming to React Native at some point. I don't know time frame, so please ask the React Native team. But certainly, but when that arrives, relay hooks will just work right the same way it does with on the web for concurrent mode. But basically, you get the sort of legacy suspense behavior, which is that if anything suspends, React will kind of immediately show a fallback, as opposed to kind of waiting and continuing to show what was on the screen before. So that's like the biggest kind of feature, missing, I think, aspect with hooks in legacy mode is, if you go to refetch something and we don't have the data for that you're trying to refetch, then we immediately suspend and show a spinner, as opposed to continuing to show what was on the screen until the new thing arrives. And so that's the one area that I think we're going to still look at and see if we can come up with a nicer solution for legacy mode. Because if we can, I think that would kind of help people to bridge the gap, right? We don't want to have people not upgrade to using these better APIs just because they can't upgrade to concurrent mode, but also like you really should upgrade to concurrent mode because it's a better experience. So we're kind of that's one thing I think we're still just figuring out.
Yeah, because that's the one problem I've heard about people using it in React Native is that refetching experience, that you can't really control it, and it's also hard to figure out why things suspend in that case, like what field you're missing and whatnot. So that's great if there's some form of solution for that, of course.
We're actually meeting with the React core team about this issue, and we're planning on having some sort of workaround that that will work with hooks and won't suspend. Whether it will cover every single case that concurrent mode would handle, I don't know. But hopefully the major cases of refetching when you don't need to suspend will be handled in the major hooks release.
Yeah. So I guess to sum up the React Native question, there's no relay with hooks should work in. There's no reason for it not to work in React Native in legacy mode. And exactly. The one quirk we have is the refetching behavior, yep. And hopefully that could be in some ways solved. But otherwise, it's not. Yeah, it's a first-class citizen, just like Web React, I guess. Cool. Do we have any more that I missed here in the chat? I don't think so. Yeah, I guess that sums up this session. Unless is there anything you'd like to add? Finishing off here, we've got so much new juicy information here, so it's nice to be able to digest all this. But do you have any parting words from the core team?
Thanks for continuing to use Relay and support us. It's I know Relay is obviously not like the easiest framework to pick up, but it's really been incredible to see the many interesting contributions from the community, and I don't know, it's always really fun. I think one of my favorite things is to open GitHub notifications and look at the PRs, click into a PR and be like, wow, that's like a really well done PR. There's also some that are like, talk to us first next time. That also happens too. But that's also great to see. Like it's just great to see the interest from the community. So it's just really humbling that like people outside of people who are paid to write relay code at Facebook are interested in using this technology. I mean, obviously we think it's great. We know its flaws, but it's really just like fun to get the feedback from the community and see this helping people. So yeah, thanks to you, and thanks for running the meetup and yeah.
And thank you for coming on. I think this is it's a very appreciated part to be able to have this Q&A kind of session with you. It's very nice.
I'm always happy to talk like technology. Like I just have to like restrain myself this entire time of like going into like this deep dive of like how all of these things work. So if anyone wants to hear like far deeper technical details about how Relay works, I am happy to give that very long podcast. Just throwing that out there.
That's excellent. So I guess that'll sum it up for now. I believe I have another slide. We'll see here. Yes, yeah, we have a Discord that you can visit if you want, and I'll be hanging around there at least some after this, and we could just chat about the topics we talked about here, or do a voice chat or whatever. I will also make sure to chop this session up in smaller parts and tweet the various segments that we've covered, so it's easier to find. And again, like the news about the docs is great, and also it's awesome that we've got a timeline now for the various stages here of the new features. And like it's really interesting to follow you from the side because you work on so many interesting aspects, and it's also nice to see all of these projects kind of reach their goals. And I can imagine that you must feel you've had a lot of like big chunks of work that are finally coming to fruition. So it's and I believe you've had it mostly stable internally, of course, for a while, but for us in open source, it's really nice to see those land. So thank you for all your work, and thank you for sharing it with us. And coming on here and talking about it. So so for anyone who's interested, I'll be around in the Discord. And again, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you for organizing.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, this was really fun.
Well, thank you. Until next time.
All right,
see ya.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.